Welcome to another deep dive. Today, we're going to be looking at road traffic accidents, RTAs. And you sent over some fascinating stuff for this. It looks like lecture notes and case studies from a forensic medicine course,
Yeah, that's right.
all about the injuries and investigations.
Yeah.
So we're going to be unpacking the forces at play, the types of injuries they cause, and how investigators piece together those hit and run cases. But first, this fact really struck me from what you sent. Did you know that the risk of dying while riding a motorcycle is 20 times higher than in a car for every kilometer traveled?
Yeah, it's a pretty sobering statistic.
Yeah.
And it really highlights just how vulnerable motorcyclists are and other unprotected road users
Think
when
about
they're involved in a crash.
Yeah, speaking of vulnerability, if we zoom out to the global picture of RTAs, the sources mentioned there are about 1.19 million RTA deaths every year worldwide. That's a huge number, even though it's actually a decrease from earlier reports.
Yeah, it is a decrease. But while the overall trend is encouraging, certain regions still have alarmingly high rates of RTAs. Southeast Asia, the Western Pacific, and Africa, for
Yeah.
example. They see a disproportionate number of these accidents.
And then if we zero in on Sri Lanka specifically, the numbers have been fluctuating around 2,300 to 2,500 deaths for years, but then there was a worrying increase in 2016 and 2017, over 3,000 deaths each year.
Yeah, it's a concerning trend.
Yeah.
And to kind of break it down, that's about 150 reported accidents every day in Sri Lanka, with an average of 5 to 6 lives lost.
Wow. Those numbers really put it into perspective. It's easy to think about statistics abstractly, but when you put it in those terms, the impact becomes much clearer.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah. And it's important to note that globally, more than half of all RTA deaths involve what are called vulnerable road users. These are pedestrians, cyclists, motorcyclists, people who don't have that protection of a vehicle shell around them.
No metal page.
Yeah. Makes sense why they're at such higher risk.
Yeah.
But let's go beyond just the numbers and dig into the science behind how these injuries actually happen. It's fascinating and kind of disturbing
Yeah.
how much detail the sources go into.
Yeah, it is fascinating. And one thing that stood out to me was the idea that it's not just speed that causes harm in an accident, it's the change in speed.
So you could be traveling at a high speed and be perfectly fine as long as you don't suddenly stop or change direction.
Exactly. Yeah. It's that rapid acceleration or deceleration
Okay.
that is dangerous because of the forces generated,
Right.
which often measured in g-forces.
Okay.
The faster that change in speed, the higher the g-forces, and the greater the potential for serious injury.
Okay. That makes sense.
Yeah.
Kind of like how astronauts experience high G forces during takeoff and landing.
Yeah. That's a great analogy.
Yeah.
And just like those astronauts are trained to withstand those forces, our bodies have limits too.
So how did those G forces actually play out differently depending on whether you're a pedestrian, a motorcyclist, or even the driver inside a car?
Well, let's start with pedestrian accidents.
Okay.
The sources describe them as almost a chain reaction of impacts.
A chain reaction. So it's not just one single hit.
No, not at all. Imagine a pedestrian being struck by a car.
Okay.
There's the primary impact, which is that initial point of contact with the vehicle. But then, because of the force involved, the person is often thrown onto another part of the car, like the hood or the windshield.
Okay.
That's the secondary impact.
So it's like they're being tossed around by the car.
Exactly, yeah.
Wow.
And then there's the tertiary impact, where they
Right.
finally hit the ground or some other object in the environment.
So 3.
Each of these impacts can cause its own unique pattern of injuries, and understanding that sequence is key for investigators.
Wow. That's pretty disturbing, but it makes sense. The sources go into quite a bit of detail about the specific types of injuries seen in pedestrian accidents. Is there anything that really stands out to you?
Well, they talk about bumper injuries,
Okay.
which are common in pedestrian accidents. By measuring the height of a leg injury, for example, investigators can sometimes match it to the height of the bumper on the suspect vehicle.
Wait, so the injury itself can be a clue.
Yeah, it is.
That's pretty amazing.
And even the shape of a wedge fracture in the leg bone can tell investigators the direction from which the impact came.
Really?
Yeah.
Wow. That's incredible how much information they can get from the injuries.
Yeah.
Anything else in those details that surprised you?
Well, there's a detail about sparrowfoot lacerations.
Sparrowfoot. What an odd name. What are those?
They're actually tiny, irregular cuts caused by shattered windscreen glass raining down onto the victim after the impact. They might seem minor compared to other injuries,
Right.
but they can be a valuable clue in a hit-and-run case. Yeah.
It's fascinating how these seemingly small details can be so important in an investigation.
Hmm.
And of course, we can't forget about the horrific injuries caused when someone is actually run over by a vehicle.
Yeah, those are unfortunately common and
Wow.
and often fatal.
Yeah.
The weight of the vehicle can cause severe crushing injuries, and the rotating tires can create a distinctive flaying injury
Right.
where skin and muscle are torn away.
It's hard to even imagine.
Right.
Okay, let's move on to motorcyclists and cyclists. We already talked about how they're classified as vulnerable road users,
Yeah,
and we know that their risk of death is significantly higher
right.
than for car occupants. What kinds of injuries are most common in these cases?
While head injuries are a major concern, particularly in the temporoparietal region of the skull.
Okay.
That's the area on the side of your head above your ear.
Makes sense since there's no helmet to protect them in a car.
Exactly, yeah.
Right.
And there are some specific types of skull fractures associated with motorcycle accidents that investigators look for.
Like what?
Well, one is called the motorcyclist fracture, and it's a type of basal skull fracture, a hinge fracture to be precise,
Okay.
that runs across the floor of the skull.
Oh, wow.
And then there's the ring fracture, which happens around the foramen magnum, the opening at the base of your skull where your spinal cord connects to your brain. It's caused by a direct impact to the top of the head.
So the type of fracture can actually tell investigators how the impact happened. That's like a forensic puzzle piece.
Exactly. And that's why understanding these patterns is so important. By studying the injuries, they can start to reconstruct the accident and determine things like the direction of impact, the speed involved, and even the type of vehicle that might have been involved in a hit and run.
So it's not just about treating the injuries.
You know,
It's about using them as clues to understand what happened.
precisely.
Wow. Beyond head injuries, what else do we see a lot of?
Well, we also often see cervical spine fractures in motorcyclists and cyclists, as well as various lower limb injuries. Those can be from direct impact with the ground or other objects, or even from contact with the motorcycle's crash bars.
It's amazing how even parts designed to protect them can sometimes contribute to the injuries.
Yeah, you're right. And there's another detail from the notes that's particularly surprising. Genital and perineal injuries in male riders.
Really, why would that happen?
It's due to the way they straddle the seat,
Oh, okay.
and the impact can cause forceful compression in that area.
Wow, I wouldn't have expected that.
Yeah,
It just goes to show how unpredictable the forces in these accidents can be.
right.
And we can't forget about pillion riders, the passengers on the back of the motorcycle.
Absolutely. They're often thrown upwards and forwards in a crash, and that can lead to very specific injuries. There's also the added risk of clothing, like a sari, getting entangled in the bike's sari guard, or even burns from the silencer.
Wow. It's a reminder of how much more vulnerable they are compared to someone inside a vehicle. Okay, so we've talked about pedestrians and those on two wheels. Let's shift gears now and look at the people inside the car. Does being surrounded by the car's structure change the types of injuries they're likely to get?
Definitely. The sources emphasize that in frontal impacts, it's all about deceleration, that car is rapid slowing down.
Okay.
But in rear-end collisions, it's acceleration that comes into play.
Okay, so let's start with the driver. What happens to them in a crash?
Imagine hitting a solid wall at 80 kilometers per hour.
Okay, I'm imagining it, and it's not pretty.
Right. The G-forces in that scenario are immense,
Right.
and that's why seatbelts are so crucial.
Okay.
They distribute the force over a wider area, reducing that peak G-force impact on any one part of the body.
So they're essentially slowing you down more gradually.
Actually, yeah. Without a seatbelt, the driver's head is likely to slam into the steering wheel or the windshield. Their chest might hit the steering column, and there's a high risk of whiplash.
Ouch. And then there's the internal injuries,
Right.
which might not be immediately obvious, but can be just as dangerous.
Yes, those are a major concern. We see things like aortic rupture, sometimes called ladder tears, where the aorta, the main artery from the heart, tears. There's also the risk of cardiac contusion, which is bruising of the heart, and damage to the lungs and abdominal organs.
Wow. So even if there aren't any visible external injuries, the internal damage can be life-threatening.
Absolutely, yeah. And all those same risks apply to the front seat passenger, but with an added layer of danger.
How so? They're still inside the car, right?
They are, but they don't have the steering wheel to brace against, and they often have less time to anticipate the crash.
Right.
This can make ejection from the vehicle more likely if they aren't wearing a seatbelt.
Oh, that makes sense.
Yeah.
Are there any injuries that are more specific to the front seat passenger?
We often see those sparrowfoot lacerations again from the windscreen glass. And there's also a higher chance of impact with the dashboard or the glove compartment, leading to a range of injuries depending on the layout of the car.
It's fascinating and a little scary to think about how each position in the car can affect the types of injuries you might sustain.
Hmm.
What about the folks in the back seat? I imagine their injuries are less predictable since they're further away from the point of impact.
You're right. The patterns are definitely more variable depending on whether they were wearing a seatbelt and the direction of impact. But some common injuries include hip dislocations, limb fractures, and head injuries, including whiplash.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah.
So we've covered pedestrians, motorcyclists, and cyclists, and now the people inside the car. What's next in our deep dive into the world of RTAs?
Now, here's where things get really interesting. We often think of safety features in vehicles as purely beneficial, right?
Right.
But the sources point out that they can be a bit of a double-edged sword.
Wait, how can safety features cause harm? Isn't the whole point to protect us?
Yeah, that's the idea, of course. And overall, they're incredibly effective at reducing the severity of injuries and accidents.
Right.
But the forces involved in a crash are so powerful
Yeah.
that sometimes even devices meant to protect us can contribute to the injury pattern.
Okay, I'm intrigued.
Yeah.
What kind of injuries are we talking about?
Take seatbelts, for example.
Okay.
They're lifesavers, no doubt about it, but they can also cause injuries like clavicle or sternal fractures
Oh.
from that restraint across the chest,
Right.
abdominal organ damage from the belt pressing inwards, and even lumbar spine and aorta issues.
Wow, I never thought about that. So it's like a trade-off, reducing the risk of one type of injury, but potentially increasing the risk of another?
In a way, yeah.
Mhm.
And then there are airbags,
Right.
those rapid inflating cushions designed to protect us from hitting hard surfaces.
Yeah.
But they too can cause harm. Things like facial bruising, eye injuries, even shoulder and arm injuries.
Injuries. That's some an airbag. Yeah. Yeah, sometimes.
That's pretty disturbing. So it's not a simple equation of safety feature equals good, no safety feature equals bad.
Right.
It's much more nuanced than that.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's all about understanding the complex interplay of forces in a crash
Right.
and how those forces interact with both the human body and the safety devices designed to protect it.
Yeah. This is making me think about how much I rely on those safety features to protect us.
Right.
But maybe it also highlights the importance of preventing those crashes in the first place.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Prevention is always the best approach.
Right.
But unfortunately, accidents do happen.
Yeah.
And when they do, there's a whole team of people who step in to investigate, especially in cases where the driver flees the scene.
You're talking about hit and run investigations.
Yeah.
Those must be incredibly challenging to solve.
They are. Imagine a body is found by the roadside.
Okay.
No witnesses, no vehicle in sight,
Right.
just the victim.
Yeah.
And a lot of unanswered questions. It's like a puzzle with some of the pieces missing.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Where do investigators even begin?
Right.
The first step is a thorough examination of the scene.
Okay.
They're looking for any clues that might point to the vehicle involved. Tire marks, vehicle fragments, even tiny bits of trace evidence, like paint chips, glass shards,
Right.
anything that could link back to the car.
So it's a bit like those crime shows where they're meticulously combing the area for every little detail.
Exactly, yeah. They're looking for anything that could help them understand what happened
Yeah.
and identify the vehicle involved. And alongside the scene examination,
Right.
they're also working to identify the victim.
Right.
This can be straightforward if they have ID on them,
Sure.
but often they need to use other methods
Right.
like facial recognition, dental records, personal belongings,
Right.
tattoos, fingerprints, or even DNA analysis.
Yeah. It sounds like every piece of information, no matter how small, could be a piece of the puzzle.
Absolutely. Even the victim's clothing is examined carefully, not just for identification, but also for potential trace evidence. Fibers from the vehicle's interior, paint smears,
Okay.
anything that could help connect the victim to the car.
It's amazing how much information can be gleaned from these tiny details.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah. And speaking of details, the documentation of the victim's injuries is also incredibly important.
Yes.
Every injury, its type, pattern, and location.
Right.
These are all clues that can help investigators reconstruct the incident and narrow down the possibilities.
Yeah.
So, for example, the height of a certain injury could tell them something about the height of the vehicle that hit them.
Exactly. Or the pattern of injuries might indicate whether the person was hit from the front, the side, or run over.
Right.
Yeah, it all helps build a picture of what happened.
And then, of course, there's the internal examination during the autopsy.
Right.
This is crucial for ruling out any natural causes of death and determining the precise cause of death related to the accident.
Was it massive internal bleeding?
Traumatic brain injury or multiple organ failure.
Right.
So they're piecing together the story using both external and internal evidence.
Precisely. And there are often lab analyses involved as well. Toxicology reports to see if alcohol or drugs played a role,
Right.
and detailed analysis of any trace evidence collected. For example, paint chips from the scene can be compared to automotive paint databases
Okay.
to try and narrow down the make and model of the vehicle involved.
So it's really a multifaceted investigation with experts from various fields all working together to solve the case.
Exactly. It's a team effort, and the goal is to use all the available information to build a comprehensive picture of what happened,
Right.
identify the vehicle and driver, and hopefully bring justice for the victim and their family.
That's a lot of responsibility on the shoulders of these forensic investigators.
It is. They're not just determining the cause of death.
Okay.
They're playing a crucial role in the justice system. Now let's shift gears slightly
Okay.
and talk about another type of transportation-related death, railway incidents.
Okay. Railway incidents. What makes them different from typical road traffic accidents?
Well, one key difference is the question of intent.
Okay.
Was it an accident, a suicide,
Right.
or even a homicide disguised as a railway fatality?
Oh, that adds a whole new layer of complexity.
It does. The sources mention various scenarios: people accidentally falling from overcrowded trains, being hit by trains at unprotected crossings, suicides where someone jumps in front of a train, and homicides where someone is pushed or their body is disposed of on the tracks after being killed elsewhere.
So the investigators have to figure out not just how the person died, but why.
Precisely.
Right.
And the investigation follows a similar process to the hit-and-run cases we talked about.
Okay.
Scene examination, body examination, and toxicology reports are all key. But there's an added emphasis on looking for any injuries that are inconsistent with the train impact.
So those inconsistencies could be red flags for foul play.
Exactly. They might find defensive wounds, signs of a struggle, or injuries that simply don't match the physics of being hit by a train. And toxicology can reveal if the person was drugged or incapacitated before ending up on the tracks.
Right.
It's about using all the evidence to determine the most likely scenario.
It sounds like these investigations require a lot of careful observation and critical thinking.
Absolutely.
Wow. Well, we've gone from global statistics to specific injury patterns,
Yeah.
to the fascinating and sometimes unsettling world of forensic investigation. Where do we go from here in our deep dive? So we've covered a lot in this deep dive, from the global scale of RTAs down to the specific types of injuries they cause. We even got a little peek into how investigators piece together the clues in hit and runs and railway incidents.
It's been quite a journey. And while we've focused on the aftermath of these accidents, the forensic details and the investigations, it's important to remember that prevention is key.
That's a really good point. We've talked a lot about what happens after a crash, but what can be done to try to prevent them from happening in the first place?
Well, it's a multi-pronged approach. The sources we've looked at, while focused on forensic medicine, do hint at the importance of a more holistic strategy.
Okay, so what kind of strategies are we talking about?
First and foremost, I think we have to address human behavior.
Okay.
Things like speeding, drunk driving, distracted driving, even just general carelessness behind the wheel. These are all factors that contribute to a huge number of accidents.
Mhm.
And they're all things that are within our control.
Yeah, it's easy to get caught up in the technical aspects of vehicle safety or
Yeah.
our road design.
Right.
But ultimately, it comes down to the people driving those vehicles.
Exactly. And that's where education and awareness campaigns come in, right?
Yeah.
We need to constantly remind people of the risks involved, encourage safe driving practices, but it's not just about individual responsibility. We also need to look at infrastructure improvements.
So things like better roads, clear signage, safer pedestrian crossings.
Yeah, exactly. Well-maintained roads, clear signage, proper lighting, pedestrian crossings, these all contribute to a safer environment for everyone. And things like traffic calming measures
Right.
can help reduce speeding in residential areas.
So it's about designing an environment where even if someone makes a mistake, the consequences are less severe.
Precisely.
Yeah.
And then, of course, we have vehicle safety features, which we touched on earlier. Things like seat belts, airbags, anti-lock brakes, electronic stability control. These have all played a huge role in reducing both the frequency and severity of accidents.
It seems like vehicle safety technology has advanced a lot in recent years.
It definitely has, and that's encouraging.
Yep.
But there's always room for improvement. We talked about how even features like seat belts and airbags can sometimes cause harm.
Right, yeah. It's not always a simple solution.
Exactly. So continued research and development in vehicle safety technology is crucial.
Right.
And then there's the whole emerging field of autonomous vehicles,
Yeah.
which has the potential to completely revolutionize road safety.
Self-driving cars.
Yeah.
It's hard to know how they'll ultimately impact accident rates. There's a lot of potential there, but also some unknowns.
Absolutely. It's an area worth watching closely. But for now, I think the focus remains on improving human behavior, infrastructure, and vehicle safety to create a world with fewer road traffic accidents.
Well said. It's striking how, even though these sources were focused on the medical and forensic aspects of RTAs,
Yeah.
they still touch on those bigger picture ideas
Right.
of prevention and safety.
Yeah, it highlights that it's all connected. Understanding the injuries, investigating the causes, it all feeds into the larger goal of preventing these accidents from happening in the first place.
I think this deep dive has really shifted my perspective. Before, I mostly thought about RTAs in terms of individual responsibility, people making bad choices behind the wheel. But now I see how it's a much bigger, more complex issue, involving everything from road design to vehicle technology to the choices we make as individuals.
Yeah. It's a systems problem, and it requires a systems approach to solve it.
Absolutely. Well, I think it's time to wrap up our deep dive into the world of road traffic accidents. We've covered a lot of ground today, from the shocking statistics to the intricate details of forensic investigations, and it's certainly been an eye-opening experience for me.
It has been. And if there's one thing I hope our listeners take away from this, it's an appreciation for the complexity of these events
Yeah.
and a renewed commitment to safety on the roads, whether you're behind the wheel, on a bike, or simply walking down the street.
Well said. And remember, every statistic represents a real person, a life impacted by an RTA. So let's all do our part to make the roads safer for everyone.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.
And until next time, stay safe out there.